On October 17th, 1814, Londoners faced an unimaginable disaster. A 15-foot tsunami of beer flooding their streets, killing 8 people and destroying entire neighborhoods. But this wasn't just a freak accident. It was the result of corporate negligence, ignored safety warnings, and a cover-up that would make modern scandals look tame. This is the true story of the day London drowned in beer. To understand how 388,000 gallons of beer became a weapon of mass destruction, we need to understand 1814 London. This was the height of the Industrial Revolution, and London was transforming from a medieval city into a modern metropolis. But with that transformation came new dangers that no one understood. The Horseshoe Brewery, owned by Moe & Company, sat in the heart of St. Giles, one of London's poorest neighbourhoods. Packed tenements housed thousands of families in squalid conditions. These weren't the wealthy areas of London where safety might have been a concern. These were the forgotten people. The brewery itself was a monument to industrial ambition. Massive wooden vats, some standing 22 feet tall, held hundreds of thousands of gallons of porter, the dark beer that was London's drink of choice. The largest vat, holding 135,000 gallons, was an engineering marvel for its time. But here's what the brewery owners knew and chose to ignore. Wooden vats of this size had never been tested at full capacity for extended periods. The physics of containing that much liquid under pressure was poorly understood. Several smaller breweries had reported concerning creaking and minor failures, but profits were too good to worry about theoretical problems. At 5:30 p.m. on October 17th, brewery worker George Crick was doing his evening rounds when he noticed something that should have sent him running. One of the metal hoops binding the giant vat had snapped. But this wasn't unusual. Metal fatigue was common and repairs were scheduled for the next day. What Crick didn't know was that this single broken hoop was now forcing the remaining hoops to bear far more weight than they were designed for. The physics were simple and deadly. Each remaining hoop now carried an extra 20,000 pounds of pressure. At exactly 5:33 p.m, the second hoop failed. Then the third. The massive wooden vat, containing enough beer to fill an Olympic swimming pool, exploded outward like a bomb. The initial blast sent a wall of beer 15 feet high crashing through the brewery wall. But this was just the beginning. The escaping beer hit 6 other massive vats, rupturing them instantly. Now 388,000 gallons of beer, weighing over 1,500 tons, was loose in the streets of London. Witnesses described a sound like thunder, followed by a brown wave that moved faster than a man could run. The beer tsunami demolished 2 houses completely, with families inside crushed instantly. The wave was so powerful it bent iron railings and shattered brick walls that had stood for centuries. But the true horror was in the basements. Many poor families in St. Giles lived in cellars below street level. When the beer wave hit, these became death traps. Entire families were trapped as the sticky, frothing beer filled their homes. Unlike water, beer doesn't flow away quickly. Its thickness and the presence of hops created a deadly foam that was impossible to swim through. Eleanor Cooper, 18 years old, was having tea with her family when the wave hit. Their basement home filled with beer in seconds. Eleanor's body wasn't found for 3 days, buried under a thick layer of beer foam that had solidified like cement. The final death toll was 8 people, but the true number was likely higher. Several bodies were never found, swept away in the beer tsunami and lost in London's sewage system. Among the confirmed dead, Eleanor Cooper, 18, Hannah Banfield, 4 years old, Sarah Bates, 60, and Mary Mulvey, 30, who was attending a wake for a child who had died the day before. The irony was bitter. Mary died in a flood of alcohol while mourning at a funeral. The injured numbered in the dozens. Beer burns were a real phenomenon. The alcohol content caused severe skin irritation, and many victims suffered what would today be called chemical burns. The brewery's porter was 8% alcohol, strong enough to cause serious tissue damage with prolonged contact. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was the public reaction. Within hours of the disaster, crowds gathered not to help with rescue efforts, but to drink free beer from the streets. People brought cups, buckets, and pots to collect beer from the gutters. Some entrepreneurs charged admission to view the disaster site. The smell was overwhelming. Thousands of gallons of beer mixed with sewage and debris created a stench that lasted for months. Residents reported that the smell of alcohol and decay was so strong it could be detected miles away. The area became known as the Beer Marsh because the ground remained soggy and alcoholic for over a year. The brewery's response was swift and shameless. Within 24 hours, Moo and Company's lawyers were claiming the disaster was an act of God, an unforeseeable natural disaster for which they bore no responsibility, but the evidence said otherwise. Court documents revealed that brewery workers had reported concerning creaking and bulging in the vat for weeks. Metal hoops had been breaking regularly with temporary repairs using rope and wire. Most damning, the brewery had received a written warning from their own engineer just 3 days before the disaster, stating that the vat was unsuitable for holding such quantities. The brewery's defense was audacious. They claimed that no one could have predicted such a failure because it had never happened before. But investigators discovered this wasn't true. A brewery in Burton-on-Trent had experienced a similar failure 2 years earlier, though with much smaller vats and no deaths. The incident had been reported in brewing industry publications that Moo and Company's management definitely read. The trial became a spectacle. The brewery hired London's most expensive lawyers, while the victims' families, mostly poor Irish immigrants, could barely afford legal representation. The class dynamics were stark: wealthy industrialists versus powerless workers. The jury's verdict was a masterpiece of 19th century victim blaming. They ruled that the disaster was indeed an act of God, and that the brewery bore no legal responsibility. The victims' families received no compensation, not a single penny. But there was one catch that the brewery hadn't anticipated: the government's tax laws. In 1814, beer was heavily taxed, and breweries were required to pay taxes on all beer produced, whether sold or not. The government demanded full tax payment on the 388,000 gallons that had flooded the streets. The brewery paid the tax but sued the government for a refund, arguing that beer used to kill people shouldn't be taxable. They lost. The beer flood exposed the complete absence of industrial safety regulations in 1814 Britain. There were no building codes for industrial structures, no safety inspections, and no legal requirements for reporting structural problems. The disaster did lead to some changes, though slowly. The first Industrial Safety Act wouldn't be passed until 1833, nearly 20 years later, but the beer flood was frequently cited in parliamentary debates as evidence that industry couldn't be trusted to self-regulate. More immediately, brewery design changed dramatically. The massive wooden vats that had seemed so innovative were abandoned in favor of smaller, safer containers. Iron bands replaced rope and wire reinforcements. Most importantly, breweries began conducting regular structural inspections, though this was voluntary and often ignored. The social impact was perhaps more significant. The beer flood became a symbol of industrial callousness toward working-class lives. It was referenced in political speeches, workers' rights pamphlets, and early socialist writings. Charles Dickens would later use similar industrial disasters as plot devices in his novels, drawing directly from the beer flood's imagery of corporate indifference to human suffering. The neighborhood itself never fully recovered. Property values plummeted, and many families moved away. The area developed a reputation for bad luck and industrial danger that lasted generations. Even today, locals in the area report that cellars sometimes smell faintly of beer during heavy rains, though this is likely psychological rather than literal. The Great London Beer Flood feels like a bizarre historical curiosity, but its lessons are painfully relevant today. Every element of the disaster, ignored safety warnings, corporate cost-cutting, regulatory failure, and class-based justice, appears regularly in modern industrial accidents. Consider the 2008 Tennessee coal ash spill, where a retention wall failed after years of ignored structural warnings, devastating a working-class community. Or the 2017 Grenfell Tower fire, where safety concerns were dismissed to save money, killing 72 people in social housing. The pattern is always the same. Companies prioritize profits over safety, warning signs are ignored, disasters strike the poorest communities hardest, and the wealthy escape consequences while victims receive little or no compensation. The beer flood reminds us that industrial accidents are rarely acts of God. They're usually acts of greed, negligence, and a justice system that protects capital over human life. In 1814, 8 people died because beer profits mattered more than poor people's safety. The question we must ask ourselves is, what has really changed? Has really